In the high desert of northwestern New Mexico, where silence stretches deeper than memory itself, ancient stones still hold their secrets. Here, beneath endless turquoise skies, the wind carries whispers of a people who built their dreams into the very bedrock of eternity. Massive walls rise from red earth like prayers made manifest, their shadows marking time not in hours, but in centuries. This is Chaco Canyon, where the past speaks in a language older than words, where every carved stone and carefully placed beam tells of human hands that shaped not just buildings, but entire ways of seeing the cosmos. In this sacred landscape, where ravens dance above ruins and starlight falls on walls that once echoed with ceremonial songs, we find ourselves standing at the threshold of one of North America's greatest mysteries. The people who built this place understood something profound about the marriage between earth and sky, between the sacred and the everyday, between the fleeting moment and the eternal dance of seasons. If this journey into history moves you, take a moment to like, share, and subscribe. Let timeless stories find new hearts, just like yours. To understand the ancient people of Chaco Canyon, one must first understand the land itself, for it was the land that shaped them as surely as they shaped it. In the heart of the San Juan Basin, where the Colorado Plateau meets the high desert, lies a landscape that seems to exist outside of ordinary time. This is a country of layered stone and painted cliffs, where geological ages lie exposed like the pages of an ancient book, each stratum telling its own story of seas that once covered this place, of mountains that rose and fell, of climates that shifted like dreams across millennia. The canyon itself runs roughly east to west for 9 miles, its walls rising in tiered cliffs of yellow and orange sandstone, creating a natural amphitheatre where every sound carries with unusual clarity. Arroyos branch off from the main wash, like fingers reaching into hidden places, each one a secret corridor where springs once bubbled from living rock, and where ancient feet wore paths that can still be traced today. The elevation here sits at 6,000 feet above sea level, high enough that winter brings snow to dust the sage and juniper, yet low enough that summer heat can shimmer off the canyon floor like water. This was not always the harsh, austere landscape that greets the modern visitor. When the ancient ones first came to this place, around the beginning of the Christian era, the climate was different, more generous. The southwest was emerging from what archaeologists call the late Archaic period, a time when slightly cooler temperatures and more reliable rainfall created conditions that would nurture one of North America's most sophisticated ancient civilizations. Pine and fir forests stretched across uplands that are now dominated by drought-resistant shrubs, and perennial streams flowed where only seasonal washes run today. The geology of Chaco Canyon reads like a textbook written in stone. The dominant cliff house sandstone laid down in ancient seas more than 70 million years ago provided the perfect building material for the master architects who would come later. This stone splits along natural plains, creating blocks that fit together with a precision that would make modern masons envious. Beneath this primary layer, the Menifee Formation contributed shales and softer sandstones, while above, harder caprock formations protected the canyon walls from erosion, preserving not only the natural architecture of the place, but also the human additions that would crown these ancient foundations. But it was not just the stone that drew people to this place. In a landscape where water is the most precious of all resources, Chaco Canyon offered something rare and wonderful: reliable sources of life-giving water. Springs emerged from the sandstone walls where impermeable layers forced groundwater to the surface, creating oases of green in an otherwise austere landscape. These springs, with names like Shabikesche and Wijiji, became the focal points around which the entire drama of Chacoan civilization would unfold. The wash that runs through the canyon bottom was fed not only by these springs, but also by seasonal runoff from the surrounding watersheds. During the summer monsoon season, when thunderclouds build like purple mountains in the afternoon sky, flash floods would roar down the arroyos, carrying with them the rich silt and organic matter that would, over time, create the deep, fertile soils of the canyon floor. The ancient people learned to work with these floods, developing sophisticated water management systems that would become one of the hallmarks of their civilization. The plant communities of ancient Chaco were as complex and interconnected as the human societies that would later develop here. Four-winged saltbush, greasewood, and shad scale dominated the valley floors, while on the canyon walls and mesas, piñon pine and juniper created parkland forests that provided nuts, berries, bark for baskets, and wood for construction. Higher elevations supported ponderosa pine and Douglas fir, resources that the Chacoans would eventually transport over great distances to incorporate into their most sacred buildings. Wildlife, too, was more abundant in this ancient landscape. Deer and elk grazed in mountain meadows that are now too arid to support such large herbivores. Bighorn sheep navigated the cliff faces with sure-footed grace, while in the valley bottoms, rabbits and rodents provided protein for human hunters who had not yet learned to depend primarily on cultivated crops. The skies teemed with birds, ravens and hawks, eagles and owls, all of which would become important in the spiritual iconography of the people who would make this canyon their sacred center. This was the stage upon which one of North America's great cultural dramas would unfold. The land itself was teacher and collaborator, providing both challenges and resources that would shape every aspect of Chacoan society. The ancient people who came to this place did not simply impose their will upon an empty landscape. They entered into a relationship with it, reading its signs and seasons, learning its languages of wind and water, stone and sky. The first people to call Chaco Canyon home belonged to what archaeologists term the archaic tradition, nomadic hunter-gatherers who moved across the southwest's vast landscapes in small bands, following the seasonal rhythms of game animals and the ripening cycles of wild plants. These early peoples left traces of their presence in the form of stone tools and temporary campsites, evidence of lives lived in constant motion across a territory that encompassed hundreds of square miles. For these archaic peoples, Chaco Canyon was likely one stop among many in their seasonal rounds, a place to harvest piñon nuts in good years, to hunt deer along the canyon walls, or to gather the tender shoots of 4 o'clock and bee plant in the spring. They knew the location of every spring, understood which plants were safe to eat and which could heal or harm, and possessed an intimate knowledge of animal behavior that allowed them to survive in a landscape that could be unforgiving to those who did not understand its ways. Around the time that Rome was consolidating its empire across the Mediterranean, something remarkable began to happen in Chaco Canyon. The descendants of these archaic peoples began to experiment with a revolutionary new way of life: agriculture. The transition was neither sudden nor complete, but rather a gradual process that unfolded over several centuries as people learned to supplement their hunting and gathering with the cultivation of corn, beans, and squash, the three sisters that would form the foundation of southwestern agriculture. Corn, originally domesticated in Mexico thousands of years earlier, had been slowly making its way northward, carried by traders and migrants who understood its potential to transform human society. The variety that reached the southwest was well adapted to high-altitude, semi-arid conditions, but it still required careful tending and reliable water sources to produce consistently good harvests. Chaco Canyon, with its springs and seasonal runoff, provided ideal conditions for this agricultural experiment. The earliest farming communities in Chaco were small and scattered, consisting of perhaps a few related families who built simple pit houses, circular or oval excavations covered with frameworks of wooden poles and brush, then sealed with mud plaster. These humble dwellings were remarkably well suited to the climate, staying cool in summer and retaining heat in winter. The people who lived in them were still primarily hunter-gatherers, but they were beginning to invest more time and energy in tending their small plots of corn and squash. Archaeological evidence from sites like Shabikashchi village, dating to around 500 CE, reveals communities that were still highly mobile, but increasingly tied to specific locations by their investment in agricultural fields and storage facilities. These early farmers developed sophisticated techniques for maximizing the productivity of their crops in an uncertain environment. They learned to plant corn in carefully prepared hills that would collect and retain precious moisture, to construct simple irrigation channels that directed spring water to their fields, and to build underground storage pits lined with stone slabs where surplus corn could be kept safe from rodents and moisture. The shift toward agriculture brought with it profound changes in social organization. For the first time in human history in this region, people began to live in settled communities for at least part of the year. Extended families started to cooperate more closely in planting, tending, and harvesting crops. The need to defend stored food from both animal and human raiders led to the development of more complex settlement patterns and the beginning of what would eventually become the elaborate defense strategies of later Chacoan society. But perhaps most importantly, the agricultural transition marked the beginning of a new relationship with the landscape itself. No longer were people simply taking what the land offered. They were actively working to increase its productivity, to channel its waters, to enhance its fertility through careful management. This new relationship required a deeper, more nuanced understanding of natural cycles: when to plant, when to harvest, how to predict rainfall, how to read the signs that warned of drought or flood. The people of early Chaco developed an increasingly sophisticated understanding of astronomy not out of abstract curiosity, but out of the practical need to time their agricultural activities precisely. They observed the movements of the sun, moon, and stars, noting how the sun's position on the horizon changed throughout the year, marking the solstices and equinoxes that would become crucial reference points for planting and ceremony. This astronomical knowledge would eventually become one of the defining characteristics of Chacoan civilization, encoded in the orientation of their greatest buildings and the alignment of their most sacred sites. Religion too began to change as people put down roots in specific places. The mobile spirituality of hunter-gatherer peoples focused on portable sacred objects, and the spirits of animals and plants encountered during seasonal travels began to give way to a more place-based religious practice. Sacred sites developed around springs and distinctive landforms within the canyon. Ceremonial chambers, precursors to the great kivas that would later define Chacoan ritual architecture, began to appear in village centers, creating focal points for community, religious life. By around 700 CE, the transition to agricultural life was largely complete in Chaco Canyon. Villages had grown larger and more permanent, with houses built not in pits but on the surface, constructed of stone and adobe in rectangular configurations that would become the architectural signature of Puebloan peoples. Population was increasing steadily as agricultural surpluses allowed families to support more children and as the settled lifestyle reduced infant mortality rates. The stage was now set for the remarkable florescence that would transform Chaco Canyon from a cluster of small farming villages into the ceremonial and administrative center of a civilization that would span much of the southwest. The agricultural foundation had been laid. The astronomical knowledge necessary for precise timing of agricultural and ceremonial cycles had been developed, and the social structures needed to coordinate large-scale construction projects were beginning to emerge. As the 9th century dawned across the southwest, Chaco Canyon stood poised on the threshold of transformation. The small farming communities that had taken root along the canyon floor over the previous centuries were about to embark on an unprecedented expansion that would forever change not only their own lives, but the entire cultural landscape of the region. This was the beginning of what archaeologists call the Pueblo Huatham period, a time of remarkable innovation in architecture, agriculture, and social organization that would lay the groundwork for the spectacular achievements to come. The catalyst for this transformation appears to have been a period of unusually favorable climate that lasted from roughly 850 to 1130 CE. Tree ring data from across the region tells a story of reliable rainfall, mild winters, and growing seasons that stretched longer than had been experienced for generations. For an agricultural people whose lives hung in the balance between abundance and scarcity, this climatic gift provided the security and surplus necessary to support increasingly complex social and architectural endeavours. Population growth was the most immediate and visible result of this agricultural bounty. Villages that had supported perhaps 50 or 100 people began to expand dramatically, with new residential areas spreading across the canyon floor and up onto the surrounding mesas. But this was not simply a matter of more people living in more houses. It represented a fundamental shift in the scale and organisation of human community in the region. The first signs of this new organisational complexity appeared in the form of what archaeologists call proto-great houses, buildings that were larger and more formally constructed than ordinary residential structures, but not yet the massive ceremonial complexes that would later define classical Chacoan architecture. These early great houses, such as the initial construction phases at Pueblo Bonito and Casa Rinconada, suggest that certain lineages or religious societies were beginning to acquire the resources and authority necessary to coordinate large-scale construction projects. The construction of these early great houses required unprecedented levels of cooperation and planning. Unlike the simple pit houses and small surface dwellings of earlier periods, these buildings demanded quarried stone blocks, carefully shaped wooden beams, and specialized construction techniques that could only be executed by skilled craftsmen working under coordinated direction. The implications of this development cannot be overstated. For the first time in the Southwest, human societies were mobilizing the labor and resources necessary to create monumental architecture. The masonry techniques developed during this period would become one of the defining characteristics of Chacoan civilization. Using the naturally occurring cliffhouse sandstone that formed the canyon walls, Chacoan builders learned to create what archaeologists call core and veneer construction. Walls with inner cores of rough stone and mud mortar, faced with carefully fitted outer veneers of thin tabular sandstone blocks. This technique created walls that were not only structurally sound but also aesthetically striking, with patterns of alternating thick and thin stone courses that created subtle visual rhythms across the faces of buildings. But it was not just the technical aspects of construction that marked this period as revolutionary. It was also the scale and ambition of the architectural projects being undertaken. The early phases of Pueblo Bonito, for example, already showed evidence of carefully planned room blocks arranged around central plazas, with specialized chamber designed for storage, residence, and ceremony. These buildings were oriented with precise attention to astronomical alignments, their walls and doorways positioned to frame specific celestial events and seasonal transitions. Water management systems also began to reach new levels of sophistication during this period. The reliable springs that had always made Chaco Canyon attractive to human settlement were now supplemented by an elaborate network of channels, dams and reservoirs designed to capture and direct the seasonal runoff from summer thunderstorms. These systems allowed Chacoan farmers to cultivate larger areas more reliably, supporting the growing population while generating the agricultural surpluses necessary to feed specialized craftsmen and religious practitioners. The famous Chacoan road system also had its origins during this period, though the great highways that would eventually stretch for hundreds of miles across the southwest began as more modest pathways connecting the growing great houses within the canyon to outlying farming settlements and resource procurement areas. These early roads were engineered with the same attention to precision that characterized Chacoan architecture, running in remarkably straight lines across difficult terrain and maintained with stone staircases, ramps and causeways that allowed travelers to cross arroyos and navigate cliff faces. Trade networks, too, began to expand dramatically during this period. Chaco Canyon's central location between the productive agricultural areas of the Rio Grande Valley to the east and the turquoise mines of the Cerrillos district to the southeast made it a natural crossroads for the exchange of goods and ideas. Chacoan traders began to range far beyond their traditional territories, bringing back exotic materials like macaw feathers from Mexico, marine shells from the Pacific coast, and copper bells from regions that are now part of modern Mexico. These trade relationships were not simply commercial enterprises. They were part of a complex web of social and religious obligations that bound communities across vast distances into what anthropologists call a regional system. Chaco Canyon was emerging as the ceremonial and administrative center of this system, the place where representatives from outlying communities would gather for great seasonal festivals, where disputes would be resolved, where marriages would be arranged between far-flung lineages, and where the ritual calendar that governed agricultural and ceremonial activities across the region would be maintained and transmitted. The pottery being produced in Chaco Canyon during this period also reflects the increasing sophistication and specialization of Chacoan society. Earlier ceramics had been primarily utilitarian vessels for cooking and storage, but now potters were creating increasingly elaborate decorated wares with complex geometric patterns that appear to encode astronomical and calendrical information. These ceramics were not just functional objects, but also works of art and vehicles for the transmission of sacred knowledge. Religious practices, too, were becoming more elaborate and formalized. The simple ceremonial chambers of earlier periods were giving way to increasingly sophisticated kivas, circular, semi-subterranean chambers that served as focal points for community ritual life. These early kivas already showed many of the features that would characterize classical Chacoan ceremonial architecture. Carefully constructed stone walls, deflector stones that helped control airflow during ceremonies, raised platforms or benches around the perimeter where participants could sit during rituals, and central fire hearths that provided both warmth and light for nighttime ceremonies. Perhaps most significantly, this period saw the emergence of what would become one of the most distinctive features of Chacoan civilization, the integration of astronomical observation into every aspect of religious and social life. The orientation of buildings, the timing of ceremonies, the organization of agricultural activities, and even the layout of settlement patterns were all coordinated according to a sophisticated understanding of celestial cycles that encompassed not only the obvious rhythms of sun and moon, but also the more subtle patterns of planetary movements and stellar configurations. By the end of the 9th century, Chaco Canyon had been transformed from a collection of small farming villages into something unprecedented in the history of the Southwest. A regional center whose influence extended across thousands of square miles, and whose architectural and cultural innovations would shape Puebloan civilization for centuries to come. The seeds of greatness that had been planted during the agricultural transition of earlier centuries were now beginning to sprout into the remarkable flowering that would define the classical period of Chacoan civilization.
The stage was set for the most spectacular phase of construction and cultural development in the canyon's history. The organizational structures were in place. The technological knowledge had been developed. The trade networks had been established. And the religious and astronomical frameworks that would guide classical Chacoan civilization had been worked out. All that was needed was the continued climatic stability and cultural productivity that would provide the material foundation for the architectural and cultural achievements that were about to unfold. As the 10th century approached, the people of Chaco Canyon could hardly have imagined the scale of the transformation that lay ahead. The modest great houses and simple road networks of their time would soon be dwarfed by architectural projects of unprecedented scope and sophistication. The regional influence that Chaco had begun to exercise would expand to encompass virtually the entire San Juan Basin and beyond, and the cultural innovations that were just beginning to emerge would create a distinctive Chacoan way of life that would inspire and influence Southwestern peoples for generations to come. This was the moment when the ancient people of Chaco Canyon stepped onto the stage of history, not as simple farmers and villagers, but as the architects of one of North America's most remarkable civilizations. The seeds of greatness that had been nurtured through centuries of gradual development were about to bloom into achievements that would astound not only their contemporaries, but also the archaeologists and historians who would study their legacy. More than 1,000 years later, the true age of Chaco was about to begin, and with it would come wonders that would transform the high desert of northwestern New Mexico into one of the most sacred and significant landscapes in all of North America. The morning sun that rose over the canyon walls at the close of the 9th century illuminated a world on the verge of transformation. In the growing great houses, in the expanding agricultural fields, in the increasingly sophisticated network of roads and trade relationships, and in the deepening complexity of religious and social institutions, all the elements were in place for the remarkable fluorescence that would soon make Chaco Canyon the beating heart of a civilization, whose influence would stretch from the mountains of Colorado to the deserts of Arizona, and from the mesas of Utah to the river valleys of New Mexico. The ancient people of Chaco Canyon were ready to write their names across the landscape in stone and adobe, creating monuments that would endure long after their voices had fallen silent and their footsteps had been erased by the patient work of wind and time. Generations had passed since the first tentative settlements took root in the canyon's embrace, and now something magnificent was stirring. The scattered pueblos that had dotted the landscape like seeds were beginning to bloom into something far grander than their ancestors could have imagined. By the year 900 CE, the canyon hummed with a new energy, a collective vision that would transform this high desert sanctuary into one of the most remarkable civilizations the Americas had ever known. The transformation began with stone. Where once the people had built with simple materials, wood and mud, reeds and clay, they now turned their eyes to the massive sandstone cliffs that surrounded them. These ancient walls, carved by wind and water over countless millennia, held within their layers the promise of permanence. The ancestors had learned to read the stone, to understand where it would split cleanly and where it would crumble, which pieces would bear weight and which would sing in the wind. Pueblo Bonitoros. Like a dream made manifest in the heart of the canyon, what had begun as a modest cluster of rooms gradually expanded, season by season, generation by generation, until it became a massive complex that defied all expectations. 4 stories high at its peak, containing over 600 rooms, it sprawled across more than 2 acres of canyon floor. The building itself seemed to breathe with the rhythm of the seasons, its walls following the ancient cardinal directions with astronomical precision. The builders of Pueblo Bonito possessed knowledge that modern architects still struggle to comprehend. Without metal tools, without wheeled vehicles, without draft animals, they quarried and transported stones weighing hundreds of pounds. They lifted massive timber beams, ponderosa pine and Douglas fir from forests miles away in the distant mountains. Each log was carefully selected, cut with stone axes, and carried by human hands across the harsh landscape to find its place in the growing structure. The masonry itself spoke of mathematical understanding that reached toward the divine. The walls were not merely functional barriers, but artistic expressions of cosmic harmony. Quran veneer construction techniques created walls of extraordinary beauty and strength. The outer faces displayed stones cut with obsidian-sharp precision, fitted together so perfectly that even today, 1,000 years later, a knife blade cannot slip between many of the joints. Behind these beautiful facades lay hearts of rubble and mud mortar. But even this hidden work was executed with meticulous care. As Pueblo Bonito grew, so too did the network of satellite communities that surrounded it. Casa, Rinconada, Emerged. On the opposite side of the canyon, its great kiva, a perfect circle measuring 63 feet across. This sacred space, dug deep into the earth and lined with carefully fitted stones, could hold hundreds of people in ceremony. The acoustics were perfect. Whisper spoken at the center could be heard clearly at the rim, while the circular walls seemed to gather and focus the voices of the assembled community into something greater than the sum of their individual songs. Kettle rose nearby, its plaza large enough to accommodate thousands of people. The building's facade stretched for more than 400 feet, punctuated by doorways and windows that created patterns of light and shadow throughout the day. Within, its walls lay specialized chambers rooms for storage, for ceremony, for the daily work of a complex society. Some rooms were clearly designed for specific crafts, their floors worn smooth by generations of artisans who worked by the light, filtering through carefully placed openings. The great houses, as archaeologists would later call these magnificent structures, were connected by a network of roads that spoke to sophisticated planning and social organization. These weren't simple walking paths worn by countless feet, but engineered roadways 30 feet wide, cut straight across the landscape. With an almost Roman directness, they climbed canyon walls via carefully constructed stairways carved into the living rock, bridged arroyos with stone causeways, and stretched for hundreds of miles in all directions from the canyon's heart. By the year 1000 CE, Chaco Canyon had become the beating heart of a trade network that stretched from the Pacific shores to the Great Plains, from the Colorado River to the Rio Grande. Exotic materials flowed into the canyon like tributaries, feeding a great river turquoise from mines in the Cerrillos Hills, abalone shells from the distant California coast, macaw feathers from the tropical forests of Mexico, copper bells that had traveled thousands of miles from Mesoamerican workshops. The turquoise trade alone transformed the canyon into a center of wealth and influence that rivaled any contemporary civilization. In the workshops of Pueblo Bonito, master craftsmen worked the blue-green stone with tools of remarkable sophistication. They created jewelry of breathtaking beauty necklaces, containing thousands of precisely shaped beads, each one requiring hours of patient labor to drill and polish. Bracelets, pendants, and ceremonial objects emerged from their workshops, many destined for trade routes that would carry them to the farthest corners of the continent. The canyon's artisans developed techniques for working turquoise that wouldn't be equaled for centuries. They understood how to heat the stone to enhance its color, how to select pieces with the proper hardness for different applications, how to combine turquoise with other materials to create works of art that spoke to both technical mastery and aesthetic vision. Some pieces were inlaid with jet, creating striking contrasts of blue and black. Others incorporated shells, coral, and amber in complex geometric patterns that seemed to capture the very essence of the southwestern landscape. But the true marvel of Chaco wasn't merely the materials that flowed into the canyon, it was the knowledge that accompanied them. With the traders came new ideas, new techniques, new stories of distant peoples and their ways of life. The Chacoan civilization became a synthesis of influences from across the continent, yet it maintained its own distinctive character, its own unique vision of how human beings might live in harmony with the demanding high desert environment. The astronomical knowledge of the Iskokoans reflected this synthesis of local observation and distant wisdom. They built their major structures in alignment with celestial events that spoke to deep understanding of cosmic cycles. The famous corner window in Pueblo Bonito, framed the rising of specific star groups at crucial times of year. Other buildings contained light boxes and shadow markers that tracked the movement of sun and moon with calendar precision. The Chacoans understood that time was not linear but cyclical, that the movements of celestial bodies reflected larger patterns of death and rebirth, scarcity and abundance. Their architectural calendar helped them predict the onset of seasonal rains, the proper times for planting and harvesting, the moments when certain ceremonies should be performed to maintain the delicate balance between human community and natural forces. This astronomical sophistication extended to their understanding of longer cycles as well. They tracked the 18.6-year lunar standstill cycle, building structures that marked the northernmost and southernmost rising points of the moon during this extended period. They observed and recorded the movements of Venus, Mars, and other celestial wanderers, incorporating their observations into a complex calendar system that coordinated both practical and spiritual activities. The canyon itself was understood not merely as a place to live, but as a sacred landscape where every feature held spiritual significance. The great sandstone cliffs weren't simply geological formations, but ancestral beings, frozen in stone yet still alive with spiritual power. The springs that provided life-giving water weren't merely natural features, but sacred portals where the spirits of the underground world communicated with the realm of human beings. Petroglyphs and pictographs decorated canyon walls throughout the region, creating an open-air gallery that recorded centuries of spiritual vision and historical memory. Some images depicted the daily life of the people hunters pursuing deer, farmers tending corn, children playing in the plaza. Others reached toward realms beyond ordinary human experience, spirals that might represent the movement of planets, or the journey of souls, anthropomorphic figures with supernatural attributes, complex geometric patterns that seemed to encode mathematical or astronomical knowledge. The placement of these rock art panels wasn't random, but followed sophisticated patterns that related to the canyon's natural acoustics, its solar orientations, and its water sources. Many were positioned where sound would carry, creating natural amphitheaters where ceremonies could be conducted with the rock art serving as a sacred backdrop. Others marked specific viewing points for astronomical observations, their imagery serving as mnemonic devices to help observers remember complex celestial patterns. Shrine sites dotted the landscape for miles around the Great Canyon, connected by the same network of roads that facilitated trade and communication. These sacred places often occupied prominent geological features, isolated buttes, natural rock arches, springs in hidden canyons. Pilgrims would travel these roads during certain seasons, carrying offerings to distant shrines and participating in ceremonies that bound together communities scattered across thousands of square miles. The Great North Road exemplified this integration of practical and spiritual purposes. This perfectly straight roadway stretched for more than 30 miles north from Pueblo Bonito, crossing difficult terrain with an unwavering determination that suggested profound spiritual significance. It led to outlying communities and sacred sites, but its ultimate destination remains one of Chaco's greatest mysteries. Some scholars believe it pointed toward important astronomical events on the northern horizon. Others suggest it represented a symbolic connection to ancestral homeland in the North Water, held particular sacred significance in this arid landscape. The Chacoans developed sophisticated systems for collecting and managing every precious drop that fell from the sky. They built elaborate networks of check dams, canals, and reservoirs that captured rainwater runoff and directed it to agricultural fields and domestic cisterns. These water management systems weren't merely functional but were integrated into the canyon's sacred geography, with ceremonial sites often positioned at key nodes in the hydrological network. The Great Kivas served as focal points for ceremonies that celebrated and maintained the spiritual relationships that made life possible in this challenging environment. These circular, semi-subterranean chambers were designed to accommodate large numbers of people while creating intimate spaces for ritual activity. Their very form echoed the cyclical nature of time and the circular horizon that surrounded the canyon dwellers within the Great Kivas. Complex ceremonies unfolded that brought together communities from across the Chacoan world. These gatherings weren't merely social events, but spiritual necessities. Moments when the scattered pueblos came together to renew their connections to each other and to the natural forces that sustained them. Dancers wearing elaborate costumes and masks embodied the spirits of rain, corn, animals, and celestial beings, their movements recreating the cosmic patterns that maintained universal harmony. Within the great stone buildings, daily life unfolded with rhythms as old as human civilization, yet uniquely adapted to the high desert environment. Families rose before dawn to begin the day's work, the men often gathering in small groups to discuss the tasks ahead, while the women prepared the first meal. Children helped with simple chores from an early age, learning through observation and participation the countless skills necessary for survival in this demanding landscape. The grinding of corn provided a constant backdrop to daily life, the steady rhythm of mono against matate creating music that spoke of sustenance and survival. Women spent hours each day processing the maize that formed the foundation of Chacoan diet, transforming the hard kernels into flour that could be formed into bread, porridge, or the countless other dishes that nourished the community. This wasn't merely utilitarian work, but held deep spiritual significance. Corn was sacred, a gift from the spirits that required proper respect and careful handling. The Chacoans had developed dozens of varieties of corn, each adapted to specific growing conditions and culinary purposes. Some varieties matured quickly, allowing harvests even in years of reduced rainfall. Others produced larger kernels for storage through the winter months. Still others were valued for their distinctive colors, red, blue, yellow, white, holding particular ceremonial significance and nutritional properties. Beans and squash completed the sacred triad of crops that sustained Chacoan civilization. Together, these three sisters provided a nutritionally complete diet that could support large populations even in the challenging high desert environment. The Chacoans understood the agricultural science behind this combination. Beans fixed nitrogen in the soil to nourish the heavy-feeding corn. How squash vines spread across the ground to conserve moisture and suppress weeds. How the three crops together provided all the essential amino acids needed for human health. Gardens and agricultural fields surrounded the great houses in carefully planned patterns that maximized water use and protection from wind. Check dams and irrigation channels directed precious rainfall to where it was needed most. Terraced fields climbed canyon walls, creating additional growing space while preventing erosion. Stone mulches conserved soil moisture and created favorable microclimates for sensitive crops. Wild plants provided important supplements to the agricultural diet. Pine nuts from the high mountains offered essential fats and proteins. Yucca provided not only edible fruits and flower buds, but also fibers for basketry and cordage. Prickly pear cactus contributed both food and medicine, its juicy fruits a welcome treat during the summer months. its pads a source of nutrition during harder times. Hunting supplemented the plant-based diet with necessary proteins and materials. For tools and clothing, deer provided meat for special occasions and hides for clothing and containers. Rabbits, caught in communal drives using long nets woven from yucca fibers, contributed both food and warm fur for winter garments. Even small mammals, birds, and reptiles found their way into the Chacoan diet. Their capture and preparation governed by elaborate protocols that honored the spirits of the slain animals. The creation of pottery represented one of the highest artistic achievements of Chacoan culture. Women shaped clay with techniques passed down through generations, their hands guided by aesthetic traditions that valued both beauty and function. Chacoan pottery was distinctive for its stark black-on-white designs, geometric patterns that seemed to capture the mathematical harmonies underlying the natural world. These ceramic vessels weren't merely containers, but works of art that reflected sophisticated understanding of design principles. Hatching and cross-hatching created visual textures that complemented the smooth curves of the pottery forms. Step patterns evoked the mesa landscape. Spiral motifs suggested the movement of wind and water. Lightning designs called upon the power of the storm clouds that brought life-giving rain. The pottery production process itself was deeply embedded in spiritual practice. Clay was gathered from sacred locations with appropriate ceremonies. The forming, drying, and firing of vessels followed protocols that ensured both technical success and spiritual protection. When a firing went wrong and vessels cracked or exploded, the failure was understood not merely as technical error, but as spiritual imbalance that required careful analysis and correction. Basketry represented another pinnacle of Chacoan artistic achievement, using willow shoots, pine needles, yucca fibers, and other plant materials. Basket makers created containers of extraordinary beauty and durability. Some baskets were so tightly woven they could hold water. Others were designed for specific purposes, carrying burdens, storing grain, winnowing chaff from grain, serving food during ceremonies. The patterns woven into these baskets carried cultural meaning that extended far beyond mere decoration. Certain designs were associated with specific clans or families. Others held religious significance, their creation and use governed by ceremonial protocols. The most elaborate baskets were reserved for special occasions, their complex patterns requiring months of patient work by master craftswomen. Chacoan society was organized around principles of kinship, reciprocity, and ceremonial obligation that created bonds strong enough to hold together a far-flung network of communities across thousands of square miles. Clans traced their descent through maternal lines, each group holding specific responsibilities for particular ceremonies. Specific knowledge about agricultural techniques or specialized craft skills that contributed to the welfare of the whole community. The great houses weren't simply residential structures but served as ceremonial centers where representatives from outlying communities gathered during important seasons. These gatherings served multiple purposes: trade, ceremony, courtship, the exchange of information about distant regions and their resources. During major festivals, the population of the canyon might swell too many times, its normal size as pilgrims arrived from across the Chacoan world. Social organization within the great houses reflected sophisticated understanding of group dynamics and resource management. Different room blocks served different functions and housed different social groups. Some areas were clearly residential, with hearths for cooking and warming, storage rooms for family possessions, and sleeping chambers Other sections served specialized functions workshops for craftsmen, ceremonial chambers, administrative areas where the complex business of managing a regional network could be conducted. The distribution of exotic goods within Chacoan sites suggests a society with marked social distinctions but also strong mechanisms for sharing resources. Rooms that contained large quantities of turquoise, shell jewelry, and other precious materials were likely occupied by families or individuals with high social status. But even modest residential areas contained some exotic items, suggesting that the benefits of the trade network reached throughout Chacoan society. Leadership in Chacoan society appears to have been based on a combination of hereditary status, ceremonial knowledge, and demonstrated competence rather than simple political power. The management of such an extensive trade network, the coordination of large construction projects, and the maintenance of social harmony across diverse communities required individuals with exceptional organizational abilities and spiritual authority. Some archaeologists believe that Chacoan society was organized around dual leadership systems, with both secular and religious authorities sharing power and responsibilities. Construction projects clearly required sophisticated engineering knowledge and the ability to coordinate the labor of hundreds or thousands of workers. The astronomical alignments built into major structures suggest the involvement of specialist astronomer priests who possessed detailed knowledge of celestial cycles. The role of women in Chacoan society appears to have been particularly important, reflecting the matrilineal kinship system that traced descent through the female line. Women controlled important economic resources, agricultural fields, stored food supplies, household goods. They were the primary producers of pottery and basketry, crafts that held both economic and ceremonial significance. The preparation and distribution of food, especially during ceremonial gatherings, gave women central roles in the social and spiritual life of the community. Children grew up within extended family networks that provided multiple sources of guidance and support. From early ages, they participated in the daily work of the community, learning practical skills through observation and practice. Boys might accompany hunting parties or help with construction projects. Girls learned the complex skills of pottery making, basketry, and food preparation. All children participated in ceremonies appropriate to their age, gradually taking on more responsible roles as they matured. Education was primarily oral, with knowledge passed down through stories, songs, and hands-on training. Elders held particular responsibility for transmitting cultural traditions, historical knowledge, and spiritual wisdom to younger generations. The detailed astronomical and calendrical knowledge that underlay Chacoan ceremony required years of careful study and marriage alliances created bonds between families and communities that strengthened the social fabric of the Chacoan world. Young people from different settlements would meet during ceremonial gatherings, their courtships supervised by family members who understood the importance of creating advantageous alliances. These marriages weren't simply personal choices, but diplomatic connections that facilitated trade, shared access to resources, and mutual support during difficult times. The movement of people between communities was constant and essential to Chacoan social organization. Specialists in particular crafts might travel between settlements to share their knowledge or complete specific projects. Young people might spend time in different communities as part of their education or to find marriage partners. Traders carried not only goods, but also news, stories, and cultural innovations from settlement to settlement, taught conflict resolution, appears to have relied heavily on ceremonial mechanisms and the authority of religious leaders rather than political power or physical force. The integration of so many diverse communities over such a large area required sophisticated methods for managing disputes and maintaining social harmony. Council meetings, ritual purification, and community ceremonies all played roles in resolving conflicts and reintegrating offenders into the social fabric. The seasonal round of ceremonies provided regular opportunities for communities to come together, renew social bonds, and address any tensions that might have developed. These gatherings weren't merely religious events, but comprehensive social institutions that served functions similar to modern diplomatic conferences, trade fairs, and cultural festivals. As the centuries passed and Chacoan civilization reached the height of its development, the social structures that had enabled such remarkable achievements began to face new challenges. The success of the Chacoan system had created a complex society that required increasingly sophisticated management to maintain. The trade networks that brought prosperity also created dependencies on distant resources. The ceremonial gatherings that maintained social cohesion also placed growing demands on local food supplies and other resources. By the early 1100s, signs of stress were beginning to appear in the archaeological record. Construction of new great houses had slowed, and some existing structures showed evidence of hasty repairs rather than the careful craftsmanship of earlier periods. The trade networks that had brought exotic materials from distant regions began to show signs of disruption. Most ominously, the careful agricultural systems that had sustained the canyon's population for generations were showing signs of degradation. Climate records from tree rings and other sources suggest that the region was entering a period of increased variability in rainfall, with more frequent droughts interspersed with years of normal or above normal precipitation. This climatic instability placed growing stress on agricultural systems that had been designed for the relatively stable conditions of earlier centuries. The concentrated population of the canyon was becoming increasingly vulnerable to environmental fluctuations. Yet even as these challenges mounted, the Chacoan people continued to create works of remarkable beauty and sophistication. The pottery of this period shows continued innovation in design and technique. New astronomical alignments were incorporated into existing structures, suggesting that the specialized knowledge traditions remained strong. The road networks continued to be maintained and even expanded in some areas. The resilience of Chacoan civilization in the face of mounting challenges testified to the strength of the social and spiritual foundations that had been laid over centuries of patient development. The coming trials would test these foundations to their limits, but they would also reveal the enduring wisdom embedded in the Chacoan way of life, wisdom that would survive even when the great stone buildings fell silent, and the canyon returned to the embrace of wind and stars. And these sacred pathways became the arteries through which the lifeblood of a civilization flowed, carrying not merely goods, but the very essence of what would become the most sophisticated trading network the ancient Southwest had ever witnessed on. The soft light of dawn that painted the canyon walls in shades of rose and gold, the first traders would emerge from the great houses, their burden baskets carefully balanced and their hearts carrying the weight of responsibility that came with representing Chaco's interests across hundreds of miles of unforgiving terrain. These were not simple merchants seeking quick profit, but the living embodiment of a complex economic system that had evolved over generations. Each trader trained from childhood in the intricate protocols of exchange that bound distant communities together in bonds stronger than blood. The turquoise mines of Cerrillos, nearly 200 miles to the east, became as familiar to Chaco's traders as their own canyon corridors. Here, in the shadow of ancient volcanic hills, they would arrive with carefully crafted pottery vessels, their surfaces bearing the distinctive black con-white geometric patterns that had become Chaco's signature across the southwest. Each pot told a story of artistic mastery and technical innovation created by hands that understood not only the practical requirements of vessel construction, but the symbolic language that spoke to communities hundreds of miles away. The exchange was never simple. A Chaco trader arriving at Cerrillos would first participate in ceremonial protocols that had been established over decades of careful relationship building. Gifts would be offered to the local spirits, prayers spoken in the ancient language that connected all people to the earth beneath their feet. Only then would the serious business of negotiation begin, conducted with the patience and respect that acknowledged this was not merely commerce, but the reinforcement of bonds that kept the entire network stable and thriving. For the turquoise they received was not ordinary stone. The brilliant blue-green mineral represented far more than decorative material. It was the physical manifestation of sky and water, the two elements most precious in this arid landscape. Chaco's craftsmen would spend months working individual pieces, grinding and polishing each bead with tools of sandstone and patience, creating ornaments that would travel to the furthest reaches of their influence. A single turquoise pendant, crafted in Chaco's workshops, might eventually adorn a leader's neck in settlements along the Rio Grande, or find its way into burial chambers in the northern reaches of what would one day be Colorado. But turquoise was only one thread in the vast tapestry of exchange that centered on Chaco Canyon. From the mountains of present-day Colorado came timber that would become the massive roof beams of the great houses, each log representing not just building material, but a relationship carefully maintained with mountain peoples who understood the sacred nature of the forests from which these giants were harvested. The logistics alone were staggering to contemplate. Teams of workers would spend weeks or even months transporting individual beams across terrain that challenged even the most experienced travelers. Yet the archaeological record shows that thousands of these logs found their way to Chaco, testament to the organizational capabilities of a society that could coordinate such massive undertakings. The journey of a single timber beam from mountain forest to Chaco Great House became a microcosm of the entire trading system. Mountain communities would carefully select trees according to specifications that had been communicated through networks of runners and traders, ensuring that each log met the precise requirements of Chaco's master builders. The felling itself was conducted according to ceremonial protocols, with offerings made to the tree spirits and careful attention paid to the phases of the moon and the movement of the seasons. Once cut, the massive logs would be stripped and shaped using stone tools of remarkable sophistication. Each cut made with the understanding that imperfection was not merely an aesthetic flaw, but a spiritual failing. The transportation of these beams required cooperation between multiple communities along the route. Relay stations would be established at strategic points, where fresh teams could take over the burden of moving these massive timbers. Food and water would be cached along the routes, and agreements would be made for safe passage through territories controlled by different groups. By the time a beam finally reached Chaco Canyon, it carried with it the spiritual energy and physical labor of dozens of people, transforming it from simple wood into something sacred, worthy of supporting the roofs under which the most important ceremonies of the Chacoan world would be conducted. From the west came shells that had traveled inland from the Pacific coast, each one a messenger from the great water that lay beyond the sunset. The journey of these shells represented one of the most remarkable aspects of the Chacoan trading system, for it demonstrated connections that spanned the entire North American continent. Abalone shells, with their iridescent inner surfaces that seemed to capture and hold the light of the ocean itself, would be worked by Chaco's artisans into ornaments of stunning beauty. The transformation of these marine treasures into sacred objects required not only technical skill, but deep understanding of the spiritual significance of water in a landscape where every drop was precious. The tropical bird feathers that adorned the costumes of Chaco's ceremonial leaders represented perhaps the most extraordinary extent of the trading networks. Macaw feathers, brilliant in scarlet and blue, traveled from the tropical regions of what is now Mexico, each plume representing a connection to the great civilizations of Mesoamerica. The acquisition of these feathers required relationships with traders who were themselves part of vast commercial networks stretching from the Valley of Mexico to the Colorado Plateau. In Chaco's ceremonial chambers, these feathers would be arranged in patterns that spoke to the movements of the sun and the sacred directions, transforming exotic materials into expressions of local spiritual understanding. But the most remarkable aspect of Chaco's trading system was not the exotic goods that flowed into the canyon, but the way these materials were transformed and redistributed throughout the Chacoan sphere of influence. Pottery vessels created in Chaco's workshops, filled with products like salt from carefully maintained salt lakes or processed corn from the fertile fields of the outlying communities, would travel along the same routes that brought raw materials into the canyon. This created a circulation system that ensured no community existed in isolation, binding together settlements across hundreds of thousands of square miles in a web of mutual dependence and shared prosperity. The cacao beans that occasionally appeared in Chacoan contexts represented the northernmost extension of Mesoamerican trading networks, bringing with them not just exotic flavoring for ceremonial drinks, but connections to the great urban centers of ancient Mexico. The chocolate prepared in Chaco's ceremonial contexts was not mere refreshment, but a sacred substance that connected local rituals to the cosmic ceremonies conducted in places like Teotihuacan and the emerging Maya centers. Each sip represented a communion not just with local spirits, but with the great cosmic forces that governed the movements of planets and the cycles of time itself. The copper bells that occasionally adorned Chacoan ceremonial regalia sang with voices that had traveled from foundries in western Mexico, their clear tones adding music to rituals that already pulsed with the rhythms of drums and the cadence of ancient chants. These bells represented technological knowledge that had flowed along the trading routes, bringing not just finished products, but understanding of metallurgical techniques that were adapted to local needs and incorporated into distinctly Chacoan forms of artistic expression as the trading networks reached their full extension, connecting Chaco to communities across half a continent. The canyon itself became the stage for ceremonial performances that were as complex and sophisticated as the economic systems that supported them. The great kivas that had been excavated from the living rock and lined with precisely fitted stones became theaters for rituals that drew participants from across the Chacoan world, creating temporary communities that numbered in the thousands. During the most important ceremonial seasons, the astronomical alignments that had been built into the architecture of the great houses now revealed their full purpose, as the movements of sun and moon and stars provided the temporal framework within which the ceremonial calendar unfolded. The summer solstice became a focal point around which months of preparation would revolve, as communities throughout the Chacoan sphere would contribute not only participants, but the materials necessary for ceremonies of unprecedented scale and complexity. The Casa Rencanada, that massive great kiva that dominated the southern portion of the canyon, became during these peak ceremonial periods a focus of activity that transformed the entire landscape. Hundreds of participants would gather in the chamber itself, while thousands more would occupy the terraces and plazas surrounding the structure, creating a human amphitheater that pulsed with the energy of shared ritual experience. The acoustics of the chamber had been designed with such precision that a whisper spoken at the center could be heard clearly at the edges of the circle, while the rhythmic chanting of large groups created resonances that seemed to make the very stones vibrate with spiritual energy. The preparation for these major ceremonies began months in advance, as communities throughout the Chacoan world would dedicate their finest craftspeople to creating the regalia and ritual objects that would be required for the performances. Feathers would be carefully cleaned and arranged according to patterns that had been established through generations of ritual practice. Textiles would be woven with designs that incorporated not only aesthetic considerations, but symbolic elements that spoke to the specific ceremonies for which they were intended. Pottery vessels would be created specifically for ceremonial use, their forms and decorations reflecting deep understanding of the ritual requirements they were designed to serve. The foods that were prepared for these gatherings represented the convergence of the entire Chacoan economic system. Corn from the most productive fields would be ground according to techniques that had been perfected over generations, creating meals of different textures and flavors appropriate for different ritual contexts. Beans and squash from carefully tended gardens would be prepared using recipes that incorporated not only nutritional considerations but spiritual understanding of the properties of different foods. Wild plants gathered from specific locations throughout the canyon and surrounding areas would add flavors and medicines that connected the participants to the broader landscape that sustained their civilization. The beverages consumed during these ceremonies represented some of the most sophisticated food technology developed by Chacoan specialists. Corn beer, fermented according to techniques that required precise timing and environmental control, would be prepared in quantities sufficient to serve thousands of participants. The containers used for these beverages were themselves works of art decorated with patterns that reflected the cosmic significance of the substances they contained. Chocolate drinks, prepared from cacao beans that had traveled hundreds of miles from tropical regions, would be flavored with honey and wild plants, creating beverages that were both nourishment and sacrament. The music that accompanied these ceremonies drew upon instruments and techniques that had been developed specifically for the acoustic environment of the great kivas and plazas. Drums crafted from specially selected woods and stretched with hides that had been prepared according to ceremonial protocols would provide rhythmic foundations that could be felt as much as heard, their vibrations traveling through the stone floors and walls to create physical as well as auditory experiences. Flutes carved from bones and reeds would add melodic elements that soared above the deeper rhythms, their voices carrying messages that seemed to bridge the earthly and spiritual realms. The dancers performed in these ceremonial contexts represented the culmination of artistic traditions that had been developing for generations. Choreographed movements that incorporated not only aesthetic considerations, but deep understanding of the cosmic forces they were meant to influence would transform the great kivas into theaters for performances that lasted for days. Participants would wear costumes that transformed them into representations of spiritual beings, their movements controlled by ritual requirements that had been transmitted through generations of careful teaching and practice. The masks worn by Certain ceremonial participants represented some of the most sophisticated artistic achievements of Chacoan culture. Carved from wood that had been selected not only for its practical properties, but for its spiritual significance. These masks would be painted with pigments that had been gathered from specific locations and prepared according to techniques that were themselves part of the ritual tradition. The transformation of a human face into the representation of a spiritual being was understood to be not merely symbolic but a literal change in the nature of the individual wearing the mask, requiring preparation that included fasting, purification, and spiritual instruction that could last for months. The astronomical observations that guided the timing of these ceremonies required specialists who had dedicated their lives to understanding the movements of celestial bodies. These sky watchers would maintain observation stations throughout the canyon, carefully noting the positions of stars and planets and the phases of the moon. Their calculations would determine not only the timing of major ceremonies, but the specific moments within those ceremonies when particular rituals should be performed, creating a precise synchronization between earthly activities and cosmic events that reinforced the Chacoan understanding of their place within the universal order. The winter solstice ceremonies represented perhaps the most spiritually intense period of the Chacoan ceremonial calendar. As the sun reached its southernmost point and the days grew shortest, the great houses would be filled with activities designed to encourage the return of longer days and the renewal of the agricultural cycle. Special fires would be lit in the great kivas, their flames representing the sun's power and humanity's partnership with the cosmic forces that governed the cycles of growth and harvest. Offerings would be made to ensure the fertility of the coming year, while prayers would be spoken that connected the immediate needs of the community to the broader patterns of cosmic renewal. The pilgrimage routes that led to Chaco during these ceremonial periods became sacred pathways marked by shrines and resting places that had been established over generations of use. Travelers would follow these routes not merely as practical transportation corridors, but as spiritual journeys that began the process of transformation that would culminate in participation in the canyon's great ceremonies. Along these routes, smaller ceremonies would be conducted that prepared pilgrims for the intense spiritual experiences that awaited them at their destination. During this golden age of ceremonial complexity and trading sophistication, the architectural landscape of Chaco Canyon underwent its most dramatic transformation, as the great houses grew not only in size but in symbolic importance, becoming physical manifestations of the spiritual and temporal authority that emanated from this desert center. The construction projects undertaken during this period represented organizational capabilities that rivaled those of any ancient civilization, requiring coordination of labor and resources on a scale that spoke to social systems of remarkable sophistication and stability. Pueblo Bonito, already the largest structure in the canyon, continued to grow through carefully planned additions that expanded not only its physical footprint but its capacity to house the various activities that had become central to Chacoan civilization. New room blocks were added according to architectural principles that maintained the structure's astronomical alignments while accommodating the practical needs of an increasingly complex society. The precision of this construction was evident in every detail, from the careful coursing of the sandstone masonry to the exact placement of doorways and windows that created sightlines, connecting different parts of the structure to significant points on the horizon. The masonry techniques employed during this period represented the pinnacle of Chacoan building technology. Stones were selected not only for their structural properties, but for their color and texture, creating walls that were as much works of art as they were functional architecture. The famous Chacoan masonry style, with its precisely fitted stones and minimal use of mortar, created walls that have stood for nearly 1,000 years, their surfaces still bearing the marks of the tools used by ancient craftsmen who understood their work to be not merely construction but the creation of sacred space. Petroglyphs, the second largest great house in the canyon, underwent during this period expansions that demonstrated the increasing importance of communal gathering spaces within Chacoan architecture. The great kiva associated with this structure was rebuilt to accommodate larger numbers of participants, while new plazas were created that could host the thousands of visitors who traveled to Chaco during major ceremonial periods. The integration of these spaces showed sophisticated understanding of crowd flow and social dynamics, creating environments that could facilitate both intimate ceremonial activities and large-scale public gatherings. The construction of Pueblo del Arroyo during this period demonstrated the continuing evolution of Chacoan architectural concepts. This great house incorporated innovations in room design and spatial organization that reflected changing social needs and ceremonial requirements. The famous tri-wall structure associated with this building represented a unique architectural form that appeared nowhere else in the ancient Southwest, suggesting that Chacoan builders were continuing to experiment with new forms of sacred architecture even as their basic building techniques reached new levels of sophistication. Casa Rencanada, the great kiva that dominated the south side of the canyon, reached its final form during this period, becoming not just the largest ceremonial structure in Chaco, but one of the most remarkable architectural achievements of the ancient Americas. The precise circular form of this structure, with its sophisticated system of niches and platforms, created an environment that was acoustically perfect for large-scale ceremonial performances. The astronomical alignments built into the structure allowed celestial events to be incorporated directly into ritual activities, creating a fusion of architecture and ceremony that transformed the building itself into a massive ritual instrument. The road system that connected Chaco to outlying communities reached its full development during this period, creating a transportation network that was as much about symbolic connection as practical movement. These roads were not mere trails worn by foot traffic, but engineered corridors that maintained straight lines across difficult terrain, often including constructed ramps and stairways that allowed passage through areas that would otherwise have been impassable. The precision of these roads, many of which can still be traced today, demonstrated the application of sophisticated surveying techniques that allowed Chacoan engineers to maintain exact compass bearings across distances of hundreds of miles. The Great North Road, which extended from Chaco Canyon toward the San Juan River region, represented perhaps the most ambitious engineering project undertaken by the ancient inhabitants of the Southwest. This corridor, 30 feet wide in places, required the removal of countless tons of stone and earth, the construction of causeways across arroyos and washes, and the creation of signal stations that allowed communication across the entire length of the route. The investment of labor represented by this single road would have required the cooperation of dozens of communities over many years, speaking to organizational capabilities that could coordinate massive projects across vast distances. The outlying great houses that were constructed during this period created a network of Chacoan architecture that extended the canyon's influence across hundreds of miles. These structures, built according to the same architectural principles as the great houses of the canyon itself, served as regional centers that could accommodate the ceremonial and administrative needs of local populations while maintaining Their connection to the central authority of Chaco, the similarity of construction, techniques and architectural details across this vast area demonstrated the existence of specialized knowledge that was carefully transmitted from master builders to their apprentices, ensuring consistency of design and construction quality across the entire Chacoan world. The water management systems that supported these architectural achievements represented some of the most sophisticated hydraulic engineering developed by ancient peoples of North America. Elaborate networks of dams, channels, and reservoirs were constructed to capture and direct the limited precipitation that fell in this arid region. These systems required not only engineering expertise, but deep understanding of local weather patterns and seasonal variations, allowing Chacoan engineers to maximize the effectiveness of every drop of water that could be captured and controlled. The Chaco Wash itself was modified during this period through the construction of elaborate check dams and water control features that transformed the natural drainage system into a managed resource that could support the agricultural needs of a population that numbered in the thousands during peak ceremonial periods. These modifications required careful coordination with the natural systems of the canyon, demonstrating ecological understanding that allowed intensive use of resources without destroying the environmental foundations upon which the entire civilization depended. The signaling stations that were constructed during this period created a communication network that allowed rapid transmission of information across the entire Chacoan sphere of influence. These carefully positioned structures, often built on high points that commanded extensive views, were connected by sightlines that allowed messages to be relayed across hundreds of miles in a matter of hours. The sophistication of this system rivaled the communication networks of much later civilizations, demonstrating organizational capabilities that allowed centralized coordination of activities across vast distances. The astronomical observation stations that were built during this period represented the culmination of centuries of sky watching and celestial observation. These structures incorporated sophisticated understanding of solar and lunar cycles, allowing Chacoan astronomers to predict eclipses, track the movements of planets, and maintain calendar systems that coordinated ceremonial activities with cosmic events. The precision of these observations required not only technical skill, but institutional stability that could maintain accurate records across generations, speaking to social systems that valued knowledge, preservation, and systematic learning. By the mid-11th century, Chaco Canyon had become the undisputed center of the most extensive cultural and economic network ever developed by the ancient peoples of North America. The influence of Chacoan civilization extended from the Colorado Mountains in the north to the Mogollon Rim in the south, from the Rio Grande Valley in the east to regions that approached the Colorado River in the west, encompassing an area larger than many modern nations and binding together diverse communities in a web of relationships that transcended simple political or economic arrangements. The outlying communities that acknowledged Chacoan authority had grown from simple farming villages into sophisticated settlements that incorporated Chacoan architectural principles and participated in the ceremonial and economic systems that centered on the canyon. These communities maintained their local identities and traditions while participating in the broader Chacoan world, creating a form of cultural federation that allowed for both unity and diversity within a single overarching system. The delicate balance between local autonomy and central coordination represented a political achievement that would have challenged much later civilizations. The Salmon Ruins, located along the San Juan River to the north of Chaco, represented one of the most impressive examples of how Chacoan architectural and ceremonial concepts were adapted to different environmental and social contexts. This great house, constructed according to Chacoan principles but incorporating local variations, served as a regional center that could accommodate the specific needs of San Juan River communities while maintaining the connections to Chaco that were essential for participation in the broader ceremonial and economic systems. The construction of this massive structure required cooperation between local communities and builders, who brought specialized knowledge from Chaco itself, creating a fusion of local and metropolitan traditions. The Aztec ruins, despite their misleading name, represented another major center of Chacoan influence in the northern regions of the network. This impressive complex included some of the most sophisticated architecture outside of Chaco Canyon itself, with great kivas and residential structures that demonstrated the full flowering of Chacoan building traditions in a regional context. The astronomical alignments built into these structures showed that the knowledge systems developed in Chaco were being successfully transmitted to and maintained in distant communities, ensuring consistency of ceremonial and observational practices across the entire network. The Lowry Ruins in southwestern Colorado marked the northern extent of significant Chacoan influence, demonstrating that the networks centered on the canyon had successfully bridged the environmental and cultural differences that existed between the desert regions of the San Juan Basin and the montane environments of the Colorado Plateau. The adaptation of Chacoan architectural principles to this very different environmental context required innovations in construction techniques and materials that spoke to the flexibility and adaptability of Chacoan building traditions. In the eastern portions of the network, great houses like those at Guadalupe and Casamero demonstrated how Chacona influence had extended into regions that were already occupied by well-established local populations. These structures represented not the imposition of foreign architectural traditions, but the voluntary adoption of Chacoan building concepts by communities that saw advantages in participating in the broader economic and ceremonial systems that centered on the canyon. The careful integration of local and Chacoan architectural elements in these structures spoke to processes of cultural exchange that were based on mutual benefit rather than conquest or domination. The southern extent of Chacoan influence was marked by structures like the village of the Great Kivas, where Chacoan architectural concepts merged with local Mogollon traditions to create unique hybrid forms. These southern outliers demonstrated that Chacoan influence was not simply the expansion of a single cultural tradition, but the creation of a broader cultural synthesis that incorporated diverse elements while maintaining overall coherence. The ceremonial structures at these southern sites showed particular innovation in the integration of kiva and above-ground architectural forms, creating new solutions to the challenge of accommodating large-scale ceremonial activities. The logistics of maintaining this vast network required administrative and organizational capabilities that approached those of later state-level societies. The coordination of labor for major construction projects, the organization of trade expeditions that might be absent from their home communities for months at a time, and the scheduling of ceremonial activities that drew participants from across hundreds of thousands of square miles all required planning and communication systems of remarkable sophistication. The fact that this network functioned effectively for several centuries without apparent centralized coercion spoke to social and political innovations that successfully balanced local autonomy with regional coordination. The population that participated in this network during its peak probably numbered in the tens of thousands, representing one of the largest population concentrations achieved by any ancient society north of central Mexico. The agricultural systems that supported this population had been refined over generations to maximize productivity while maintaining sustainability, creating one of the most successful adaptations to semi-arid environments achieved by any ancient people. The integration of farming, hunting, and gathering activities with sophisticated trade networks created an economic foundation that could support not only basic subsistence needs, but the surplus production necessary for the elaborate ceremonial and construction activities that characterize Chacoan civilization at its peak. The craft specialization that had developed within this network represented one of its most remarkable achievements. Potters working in different parts of the Chacoan world had developed distinctive styles that nevertheless maintained overall coherence with broader Chacoan artistic traditions. Architects and builders had created regional variations of construction techniques that adapted basic principles to local materials and environmental conditions, while maintaining the precision and symbolic sophistication that characterized all Chacoan architecture. Astronomical observers had established observational stations throughout the network that allowed coordination of ceremonial activities across vast distances, creating a level of temporal coordination that rivaled much later civilizations. The knowledge systems that supported this network represented one of humanity's most impressive achievements in the organization and transmission of practical and spiritual knowledge. The architectural principles that guided construction throughout the Chacoan world required training programs that could produce skilled craftsmen in communities hundreds of miles from the canyon itself. The astronomical knowledge that coordinated ceremonial activities required observational techniques and mathematical concepts that were successfully transmitted across cultural and linguistic boundaries. The agricultural techniques that supported the entire system required understanding of soil management, water conservation, and crop rotation that was adapted to dozens of different environmental contexts while maintaining overall productivity. The artistic traditions that flourished during this period represented a synthesis of local and regional elements that created one of the most distinctive and sophisticated artistic cultures of the ancient Americas. Pottery production reached levels of technical and aesthetic achievement that have rarely been surpassed, with vessels that combined practical functionality with symbolic sophistication that spoke to deep understanding of the ceremonial and daily life contexts in which they would be used. Textile production, though less well preserved in the archaeological record, apparently reached similar levels of technical and artistic achievement, with garments that served not only practical needs but ceremonial requirements that demanded both beauty and symbolic appropriateness. The rock art that was created throughout the Chacoan world during this period provided a form of visual communication that transcended the linguistic differences that undoubtedly existed among the diverse communities that participated in the network. These images, pecked and painted on rock surfaces throughout the region, created a shared symbolic vocabulary that could communicate important ceremonial and astronomical information across cultural boundaries. The consistency of certain symbols and motifs across vast distances demonstrated the existence of shared knowledge systems that maintained coherence. Despite the geographic extent of the network, as Chaco reached the zenith of its influence and complexity, the very success of the system began to create challenges that would test the limits of ancient technology and social organization. The population that the network could support had reached levels that strained the carrying capacity of the semi-arid environment, while the complexity of the ceremonial and economic systems required administrative capabilities that pushed the boundaries of what could be achieved without written record-keeping systems. The delicate balance between local autonomy and central coordination that had made the network possible began to show signs of stress as the demands of maintaining such an extensive system grew beyond the capacity of traditional organizational methods. Yet during these peak years, for those who lived within the Chacoan world, the achievements of their civilization must have seemed eternal and unshakable. The great houses stood as monuments to human capability and spiritual understanding. The trade networks brought exotic goods and knowledge from the far corners of the continent, and the ceremonial gatherings created community experiences that connected individual lives to cosmic purposes. Children growing up in this world would have learned to take for granted a level of cultural sophistication and economic prosperity that represented one of the high points of human achievement in the ancient Americas, unaware that they were witnessing the culmination of a cultural experiment that would soon face challenges that would test every aspect of the system their ancestors had so carefully constructed. The ceremonies continued beneath stars that had watched over Chaco for generations. Yet something profound was shifting in the very foundations of their world. Like sand beginning to slip through fingers, changes were coming that would test the resilience of a people who had built their lives around permanence. The elders noticed it first, in the way the seasons seemed to hesitate before arriving, in the subtle shifts of wind patterns that had remained constant for countless generations. The summer rains, once as reliable as the sunrise, began to arrive later and depart earlier. The corn that had flourished in their carefully tended fields now struggled against longer periods of drought, their leaves curling inward like hands. Closing in prayer were the readers, those gifted individuals who could interpret the language of clouds and the whispers of wind, found themselves struggling to make sense of patterns that no longer followed ancient rhythms. The sky itself seemed to be learning a new language, one that the Chaco people had not yet learned to speak in Pueblo Bonita. The great rooms that had once stored surplus corn now echoed with a different kind of abundance, one measured not in overflowing granaries, but in the careful rationing of precious resources. The massive storage chambers, designed to hold the wealth of good harvests, began to require more thoughtful management as the gifts of the earth became less predictable. The ritual calendar, so precisely aligned with agricultural cycles, began to require subtle adjustments. Ceremonies that had once coincided perfectly with planting and harvest now needed to accommodate the earth's changing moods. The priests and ceremonial leaders found themselves in the delicate position of maintaining tradition while adapting to new realities. Trade relationships, too, began to shift like sand dunes, reshaped by persistent winds. Communities that had once sent regular caravans laden with goods now arrived with smaller offerings. Their own resources stretched thin by the same environmental pressures that touched Chaco, the great trade networks that had connected the canyon. Two distant lands began to require new forms of negotiation and reciprocity, yet the people adapted with the same ingenuity that had built their remarkable civilization. They developed new techniques for water conservation, creating more sophisticated systems for capturing and storing every precious drop. Their agricultural methods evolved, embracing crops that could better withstand drought and experimenting with different planting times and locations. The great kivas witnessed new kinds of ceremonies, rituals designed to call forth rain and to ask for wisdom in navigating uncertain times. The smoke that rose from these sacred spaces carried prayers that had been refined by generations of experience, now adapted to address new challenges while maintaining their essential spiritual power. Communities throughout the region began to draw closer together, sharing resources and knowledge in ways that transcended traditional boundaries. The network of relationships that had always been central to Chaco culture became even more vital as people recognized that their survival depended not on individual accumulation but on collective resilience. The children born during this time grew up understanding that adaptation was not a departure from tradition but its very essence. They learned to read the sky with new eyes, to tend the earth with even greater care, and to value the bonds between communities as sacred connections that could weather any storm. In the workshops, where artisans shaped pottery and wove textiles, new designs emerged that reflected the changing times. Patterns that had once celebrated abundance began to incorporate symbols of endurance and hope. The beautiful vessels that carried water became objects of even greater reverence, their creation imbued with prayers for the precious liquid they would hold. The architectural projects of this period showed remarkable innovation, as builders developed new techniques for water management and created structures that could better withstand the increasingly variable weather patterns. The great pueblos were modified and expanded in ways that demonstrated both practical wisdom and unwavering faith in the future. Within the established hierarchies of Chaco society, new voices began to emerge, carrying ideas that challenged traditional ways of thinking while honoring the wisdom of ancestors. Young leaders, raised in an era of change, brought fresh perspectives to ancient problems. Their solutions born from a deep understanding of both heritage and necessity. The great houses witnessed councils where elders and youth worked together to address challenges that had no precedent in living memory. These gatherings, conducted in the formal chambers that had housed decision-making for generations, now echoed with debates about adaptation and survival that required both wisdom and innovation. Women who had always played crucial roles in society found their voices gaining new prominence as their expertise in resource management and community organization became increasingly vital. The knowledge they carried about food, storage, preparation, and distribution became central to navigating the new realities of scarcity and uncertainty. The spiritual leaders of this generation faced the complex task of interpreting ancient prophecies and teachings in light of contemporary challenges. Their ceremonies evolved to address not only traditional concerns but also the new anxieties that arose from environmental instability and social change. Young architects and builders, trained in the traditional methods but faced with new challenges, began to develop innovative approaches to construction and design. Their work honored the principles established by their predecessors while adapting to the practical needs of a changing world. The trading expeditions of this era required leaders who could navigate not only the physical landscape but also the changing political and economic relationships between communities. These individuals, often younger than their predecessors, brought new diplomatic skills to the complex task of maintaining the networks that connected Chaco to the wider world. In the fields and gardens, agricultural innovations emerged from the collaboration between experienced farmers and younger cultivators who were willing to experiment with new techniques. Their combined knowledge led to the development of more resilient farming practices that could better withstand environmental variability. The artisan workshops became places of intense creativity as craftspeople sought to develop new products that could serve both practical and spiritual needs in a changing world. Their innovations in pottery, textiles, and tool-making reflected a society that was actively reimagining its relationship with the material world. Educational practices evolved as well, with traditional knowledge being passed down alongside new skills and perspectives that would be necessary for survival in an uncertain future. The teaching methods that had served the community for generations were enhanced with new content and approaches that reflected contemporary realities. The astronomical observations that had always been central to Chaco culture took on new importance. As people sought to understand whether the environmental changes they were experiencing were part of larger cycles that could be predicted and prepared for. The knowledge keepers who studied the movements of celestial bodies found their work more crucial than ever. Record-keeping practices, already sophisticated, became even more detailed as communities recognized the importance of documenting the changes they were experiencing. These records, maintained through various symbolic and artistic means, would become invaluable resources for future generations seeking to understand this pivotal period. The rituals and ceremonies that marked important life transitions began to incorporate new elements that acknowledged the challenges of the time while maintaining their essential spiritual functions. These adaptations demonstrated the flexibility and resilience of Chaco. Religious practices as the challenges mounted and the old certainties gave way to new realities. Some families and clans began to make the difficult decision to seek new homes beyond the canyon that had sheltered their ancestors for so many generations. This was not an abandonment born of despair, but a strategic adaptation born of wisdom and hope. The first to leave were often the most adventurous spirits, those who had always looked beyond the horizon with curiosity rather than fear. They departed, not as refugees, but as pioneers, carrying with them the knowledge and traditions of Chaco. While seeking new places where these gifts could flourish, their departures were marked by elaborate ceremonies that honored both the place they were leaving and the journeys they were beginning. The great Kivas witnessed rituals of blessing and protection as the community gathered to ensure that those who left would carry the spiritual essence of Chaco with them wherever they went. The migrants took with them more than material possessions. They carried the intangible heritage of architectural knowledge, agricultural techniques, spiritual practices, and social organizations that had been refined over centuries. They were not simply moving from one place to another, but transplanting an entire way of life. Some groups moved northward into the Mesa country, where they established new communities that reflected Chaco principles while adapting to different landscapes and resources. Others traveled south and east, carrying their knowledge into regions where it would blend with local traditions to create new cultural expressions. The communities that remained in Chaco maintained strong connections with those who had departed, creating networks of communication and mutual support that spanned vast distances. These relationships ensured that the dispersal strengthened rather than weakened the overall cultural fabric of the Chaco people. Trade relationships evolved to accommodate the new geographic distribution of communities with former neighbors, now connected by long-distance trails rather than short walks between pueblos. The goods that flowed along these routes carried not only material value but also news, stories, and cultural innovations from the various new settlements. The great roads that had once connected outlying communities to the central canyon now served as pathways for those seeking new homes. Their carefully engineered surfaces carrying families and their belongings toward uncertain but hopeful futures. These ancient highways became corridors of opportunity rather than simply routes to ceremony and trade. As some pueblos were gradually abandoned, others experienced periods of intensified occupation as remaining families consolidated into fewer but more concentrated communities. This concentration led to new forms of social organization and resource sharing that demonstrated remarkable adaptability. The children of this transitional period grew up understanding that identity was not tied to a single place but to a set of values, practices, and relationships that could be maintained regardless of geography. They learned to think of Chaco not as a location, but as a way of being in the world. The agricultural knowledge that had been developed in the canyon's unique environment was adapted to new landscapes, leading to innovations in farming techniques that would benefit communities throughout the region. The wisdom of Chaco farmers became a gift to the broader Southwest. Spiritual practices evolved to accommodate worship in new sacred places. As communities learned to recognize the divine presence in different landscapes while maintaining their core ceremonial traditions, the portable aspects of Chaco religion proved remarkably adaptable to new environments. The architectural traditions that had created the magnificent structures of Chaco were modified and adapted to new building materials and environmental conditions, leading to the development of distinctive regional styles that maintained essential principles while embracing local innovations. Even as many families sought new homes and new possibilities, some chose to remain in the canyon, becoming the keepers of its sacred memory and the guardians of traditions that might otherwise be lost in the turbulence of change. These dedicated souls understood that preservation required both continuity and adaptation. The remaining communities focused their efforts on maintaining the most essential ceremonies and practices, ensuring that the spiritual heart of Chaco would continue to beat even as its physical form changed. They became living libraries of traditional knowledge, their very presence a testament to endurance and faith. These guardians developed new approaches to resource management that allowed smaller populations to maintain the great structures and ceremonial sites that had been built for much larger communities. Their innovations in organization and efficiency became models for sustainable living in challenging times. The great houses that continued to be occupied were adapted for smaller populations, while maintaining their essential functions as centers of ceremony and governance. These modifications demonstrated remarkable ingenuity in preserving cultural significance, while addressing practical necessities. The ritual calendar was maintained with careful attention to its essential elements, even as some ceremonies were modified to accommodate smaller participation. The sacred sites continued to witness the performance of ancient rites, their power undiminished by the reduced scale of celebration. Educational efforts intensified as the remaining elders recognized the crucial importance of passing on traditional knowledge to younger generations, who would become the carriers of Chaco wisdom. These teaching sessions became even more precious, as they represented the continuation of cultural knowledge through uncertain times. The astronomical observations that had always been central to Chaco culture continued with undiminished precision, as the remaining specialists maintained their watch over celestial cycles that connected the community to cosmic rhythms larger than their immediate challenges. Artisans who remained in the canyon focused their efforts on creating works that would serve both practical needs and cultural preservation, their pottery, textiles, and other crafts becoming repositories of traditional techniques and symbolic knowledge. The trading networks that had made Chaco a regional center were adapted to serve the needs of a smaller but still influential community, with the canyon continuing to serve as a spiritual and cultural center even as its political and economic importance shifted. Record-keeping practices became even more important as the remaining communities recognized their role as guardians of historical memory. They developed new methods for preserving and transmitting knowledge about the great period of Chaco's civilization. The great kivas continued to serve their ceremonial functions, their sacred spaces witnessing rituals that connected the reduced population to the ancestral spirits who had participated in the same ceremonies during the canyon's most populous periods. Agricultural activities continued on a reduced scale, with the remaining farmers developing intensive techniques that allowed them to maintain productive fields while managing larger areas with fewer workers. Their innovations in sustainable agriculture became part of the evolving legacy of Chaco knowledge. The spiritual leaders who remained took on the spatial responsibility of maintaining connections with the dispersed communities, ensuring that the bonds of shared tradition would continue to unite the Chaco people regardless of their geographic distribution. Pilgrimage routes were established and maintained, allowing people from the new settlements to return periodically to participate in important ceremonies and to renew their connections to the sacred landscape of their origins. These journeys became vital links in the network of cultural continuity as the Great Transformation continued to unfold across the landscape of the American Southwest. The influence of Chaco civilization began to manifest in new and unexpected ways. The knowledge, techniques, and cultural practices that had been developed in the canyon found new expressions in the communities that carried them forward. The architectural innovations that had created the magnificent structures of Chaco influenced building traditions throughout the region, as migrant communities shared their construction knowledge with local populations. The distinctive masonry techniques, the sophisticated understanding of solar alignments, and the principles of large-scale community planning became part of a broader southwestern architectural heritage. Agricultural methods that had been perfected in the canyon's unique environment were adapted to new landscapes, leading to improved farming practices that benefited communities far beyond those with direct connections to Chaco. The water management systems, the techniques for soil conservation, and the methods for maximizing crop yields in arid environments became gifts to the entire region. The trading networks that had made Chaco a center of regional commerce evolved into new patterns of exchange that maintained many of the principles of reciprocity and mutual aid that had characterized the original system. The goods that had once flowed toward the canyon now moved between the scattered communities that had emerged from its influence. Spiritual practices that had been developed in the Great Kivas found new expressions in the ceremonial sites of distant communities. The prayers, songs, and rituals that had echoed through the canyon's sacred spaces were adapted to new environments, while maintaining their essential power and meaning. The astronomical knowledge that had been accumulated by generations of Chaco skywatchers was preserved and extended by observer priests in the new settlements. The understanding of celestial cycles, the ability to predict seasonal changes, and the knowledge of how to align human activities with cosmic rhythms continued to guide agricultural and ceremonial practices. Social organization principles that had allowed large populations to live together harmoniously in the great houses were scaled and adapted to serve the needs of new communities facing different challenges. The governance structures, the methods for resolving disputes, and the systems for organizing collective labor found new applications in new settings. Artistic traditions that had flourished in Chaco workshops were maintained and developed by craftspeople who carried their knowledge to new communities. The pottery styles, the textile patterns, and the decorative motifs that had characterized Chaco art influenced regional artistic development for generations. The oral traditions that had preserved historical memory and cultural knowledge continued to serve their vital functions in the scattered communities, with storytellers adapting their narratives to include the experiences of migration and resettlement, while maintaining the essential wisdom of ancestral teachings. Educational practices that had been developed to train young people in the complex skills needed for Chaco society were modified to serve the needs of communities facing new challenges in new environments. The apprenticeship systems, the methods for transmitting technical knowledge, and the approaches to spiritual education found new expressions while maintaining their essential functions. Medical knowledge that had been accumulated by Chaco healers was preserved and extended by practitioners who found themselves treating new ailments and working with new medicinal plants in different environments. The understanding of human health, the techniques for treating injuries and illnesses, and the spiritual aspects of healing continued to serve communities throughout the region. The record-keeping systems that had been developed to manage the complex affairs of Chaco society were adapted to serve the needs of smaller communities while maintaining their essential functions in preserving cultural memory and facilitating communication between settlements. Environmental knowledge that had been essential to survival in the canyon's challenging landscape was applied to new environments, leading to innovations in resource management and ecological adaptation that benefited communities throughout the Southwest. The diplomatic skills that had been necessary for maintaining Chaco's extensive trade and political relationships were employed in new contexts. As migrant communities established relationships with established populations in their new homes, construction techniques that had been perfected in the building of Chaco's great works were adapted to new materials and conditions, leading to architectural innovations that combined traditional knowledge with local resources and environmental requirements. Even as living communities adapted and evolved in response to changing circumstances, the great structures of Chaco Canyon remained as silent witnesses to the remarkable achievements of their builders. These massive stone edifices, precisely engineered and carefully constructed, stood as monuments to human ingenuity and spiritual devotion. Pueblo Bonito, its D-shaped form rising against the canyon wall, continued to embody the architectural mastery that had made Chaco famous throughout the region. Its hundreds of rooms, its great kivas, and its sophisticated design remained as testaments to the organizational abilities and technical skills of its creators. The great houses throughout the canyon maintained their imposing presence, their massive walls and carefully planned layouts demonstrating the sophisticated understanding of engineering and astronomy that had guided their construction. These buildings represented not just shelter but entire worldviews, made manifest in stone. The road system that had connected Chaco to distant communities remained as evidence of the remarkable logistical capabilities of the ancient builders. These carefully engineered pathways, many of them still visible after centuries, testified to the importance of connection and communication in Chaco society. The great kivas, those circular ceremonial chambers that had witnessed countless rituals and gatherings, retained their sacred power even in their silence. Their carefully calculated proportions and precise alignments continued to demonstrate the sophisticated understanding of geometry and astronomy that had informed their construction. The water management systems that had made life possible in the arid environment of the canyon remained as examples of practical engineering solutions adapted to challenging environmental conditions. The dams, canals, and reservoirs continued to function long after their creators had moved on to new homes. The residential complexes that had housed thousands of inhabitants demonstrated the sophisticated planning and social organization that had made large-scale community life possible. The room blocks, plazas, and specialized work areas revealed the complexity of daily life in the great houses. The astronomical alignments that had been built into many of the structures continued to mark the passage of celestial events. Their precisely calculated orientations, serving as permanent calendars that connected earthly activities to cosmic cycles. The workshop areas where craftspeople had created pottery, tools, and textiles remained as evidence of the sophisticated material culture that had flourished in Chaco. The stone anvils, grinding stones, and specialized work surfaces testified to the skill and industry of ancient artisans. The storage facilities that had held the agricultural surplus and trade goods that supported the complex society continued to demonstrate the importance of resource management and economic planning in the success of Chaco civilization. The defensive features that had been incorporated into some structures revealed the awareness of potential threats and the preparedness to respond to challenges that might arise from human or environmental sources. The burial sites and religious installations that had served the spiritual needs of the community maintained their sacred character, continuing to command respect from those who understood their significance in the religious life of the ancient people. The trash medins and refuse areas that had accumulated around the great houses preserved valuable information about daily life, diet, technology, and social organization that would provide insights for future generations seeking to understand Chaco society. The petroglyphs and other rock art that decorated the canyon walls continued to convey messages and meanings that connected the visible world to the realm of the sacred, their symbols serving as permanent expressions of spiritual and cultural knowledge. The natural features that had been modified or enhanced by human activity springs, agricultural, terraces, and ritual sites demonstrated the sophistication, understanding of landscape and environment that had characterized Chaco's relationship with its physical setting. These material remains, silently enduring in the high desert landscape, would eventually become the foundation for understanding and appreciating the remarkable achievements of the ancient people who had called Chaco Canyon home. They stood as permanent testimony to human creativity, adaptability, and spiritual devotion. As the sun continued its daily journey across the sky above the canyon, the shadows cast by these ancient structures moved in patterns that echoed the rhythms of life that had once animated this remarkable place. Time itself seemed to flow differently among these ruins, connecting past and future in ways that transcended ordinary understanding. The stone walls that had once enclosed bustling communities now held the silence of memory, waiting for new voices to recognize their significance and new eyes to see their beauty, carried the sacred knowledge forward, weaving the old ways into new patterns of survival and adaptation. The great exodus from Chaco Canyon was not a single moment of departure, but rather a gentle unraveling that stretched across generations like morning mist lifting from stone. By the early 13th century, the massive pueblos that had once hummed with thousands of voices stood increasingly silent, their vast chambers echoing only with wind and the occasional call of ravens that had made their homes in the abandoned rooms. Yet this was not an ending, it was a transformation, a deliberate dispersal of knowledge and tradition across the face of the Southwest. The people did not simply vanish into the desert air, as some early archaeologists once believed. Instead, they carried with them the accumulated wisdom of centuries, the intricate knowledge of astronomy and architecture, the sacred songs and ceremonial practices that had bound their community together in the canyon's embrace. Like seeds scattered on fertile ground, they established new communities throughout the region, each one carrying within it the genetic memory of Chaco's greatness. Some traveled north to the mesa tops of what would later be called Mesa Verde, where they carved new cliff dwellings into the sandstone faces and continued their astronomical observations from different vantage points. The alignment of their new structures with celestial events bore the unmistakable signature of Chacoan knowledge, adapted to new landscapes but retaining the essential understanding of humanity's relationship with the cosmos. Others moved east, to the Rio Grande Valley, where they built new pueblos along the river's fertile banks and established irrigation systems that echoed the water management techniques perfected in the canyon. The Hopi mesas, rising like ancient altars from the Arizona desert, welcomed another stream of Chacoan descendants who integrated their architectural and ceremonial knowledge with existing communities. Here, the great kivas of Chaco found new expression in the religious practices that would endure for centuries to come. The oral traditions speak of these migrations not as desperate flights from a failing homeland, but as purposeful journeys undertaken in response to spiritual guidance and environmental wisdom in each new location. The displaced Chacoans brought with them the sophisticated understanding of sustainable living that had enabled their ancestors to thrive in the challenging high desert environment. They knew how to read the subtle signs that preceded cycles of drought and abundance, how to store precious water in underground reservoirs, and how to cultivate crops that could withstand the extremes of temperature and precipitation that characterized their adopted homelands. The road system that had once connected the canyon to distant communities now served as pathways for this great dispersal along these ancient routes. Knowledge flowed like water, finding new channels, carrying with it the accumulated wisdom of generations. Trade relationships established during Chaco's heyday provided crucial connections that eased the transition to new territories and new ways of life. As the 14th century progressed, the descendant communities that had emerged from Chaco's dispersal began to develop their own distinct identities while maintaining threads of connection to their shared heritage. The Pueblo peoples of the Rio Grande Valley built magnificent new settlements like those at Qua and Coronado, where Spanish explorers would later marvel at the sophisticated urban planning and its architectural achievements that echoed Chacoan principles. The ancestral Pueblans who settled in the Four Corners region created the spectacular cliff dwellings of Mesa Verde and Cañon de Chelly, demonstrating an evolved mastery of defensive architecture that reflected lessons learned from centuries of regional cooperation and occasional conflict. The oral traditions of these scattered communities preserved not only the practical knowledge of agriculture, architecture, and astronomy, but also the deeper spiritual understanding that had given meaning to life in Chaco Canyon. Stories of the great kivas and their role in maintaining cosmic balance were passed down through generations of ceremonial leaders, ensuring that the essential knowledge would survive even as the physical structures fell into ruin. These traditions speak of Chaco not as a place that failed, but as a teacher whose lessons spread across the landscape to nurture new forms of civilization. The canyon's role as a center of learning and spiritual power was understood to have been temporary by design, part of a larger cosmic cycle that required the knowledge to be shared rather than hoarded in a single location. For nearly 4 centuries after the Great Dispersal, Chaco Canyon rested in relative silence, its massive structures gradually surrendering to the patient work of wind and weather. The absence of human voices did not mean the canyon was empty. It had simply returned to a different kind of life, one measured in the slower rhythms of geological time rather than the daily cycles of human activity. Coyotes denned in the abandoned rooms where children had once learned the names of stars. Pack rats built their middens in the corners of great kivas, creating archives of plant materials that would one day provide archaeologists with crucial information about the changing climate and vegetation of the region. The carefully constructed walls that had once supported massive timber roofs began their slow collapse as the wooden beams, imported from distant mountains with such effort and ceremony, finally succumbed to the effects of time and gravity. Yet, even in abandonment, the canyon retained its sacred character for the Pueblo peoples who had dispersed across the southwest. Pilgrimage routes continued to bring visitors to the ruins, particularly during times of ceremony and spiritual renewal. These journeys were not acts of nostalgia, but rather necessary connections to the source of knowledge and power that had once flowed from this place to nurture communities across hundreds of miles that the Navajo people who arrived in the region during these quiet centuries recognized the power that lingered in the canyon's stones. They named it Che Bia Anai. The place among the Roxanne developed their own traditions around the ruins, seeing them as evidence of the ancient people who had possessed great knowledge but had chosen to move on to other worlds. Navajo oral tradition speaks of these earlier inhabitants with respect, acknowledging their mastery of the high desert environment and their deep understanding of the relationships between earth and sky. During these centuries of apparent emptiness, the canyon continued to serve as a repository of knowledge for those who knew how to read its messages. The astronomical alignments built into the great houses remained functional, marking the solstices and equinoxes with the same precision they had demonstrated for centuries. The positions of windows and doorways continued to frame significant celestial events, providing a calendar written in stone for any who possessed the knowledge to interpret it. Spanish explorers and missionaries who entered the region in the 16th and 17th centuries occasionally encountered the ruins, but they lacked the cultural context to understand their significance. To European eyes, the massive structures represented evidence of an advanced civilization that had mysteriously vanished, fitting into preconceived notions about the rise and fall of empires, rather than the more complex reality of cultural adaptation and transformation. The Pueblo peoples who survived the devastating impacts of European colonization maintained their connections to Chaco through oral tradition and ceremonial practice, even as they faced enormous pressures to abandon their traditional ways of life. Spanish colonial authorities often viewed these connections to ancient sites as evidence of resistance to Christian conversion, leading to attempts to suppress the pilgrimage routes and ceremonial practices that had preserved Chacoan knowledge. For centuries, despite these pressures, the essential knowledge survived, encoded in stories, songs, and ceremonial practices that could be adapted to changing circumstances while retaining their core meanings. Hopi tradition speaks of migration stories that trace the journeys of clans from Chaco to their present homeland, while Pueblo communities along the Rio Grande maintain ceremonial cycles that incorporate astronomical knowledge first developed. In the canyon's great houses, the trading relationships that had once connected Chaco to distant communities evolved into new patterns of exchange and communication. But the underlying networks of kinship and ceremonial obligation continued to link Pueblo communities across vast distances. These connections would prove crucial in maintaining cultural continuity through the traumatic centuries of European colonization and forced assimilation. Mexican independence in 1821 brought new waves of settlers into the Southwest, including traders and explorers who were among the first outsiders to document the ruins with something approaching scientific curiosity. These early accounts, while often colored by the cultural assumptions of their time, began to recognize the sophisticated nature of Chacoan architecture and the complexity of the society that had created it. The middle of the 19th century brought the first systematic attempts by European American scholars to understand the mystery of Chaco Canyon. Lieutenant James Simpson of the U.S. Army Corps of Topographical Engineers encountered the ruins in 1849 while conducting a military reconnaissance of the region, and his detailed descriptions introduced the wider world to the sophistication of Chacoan architecture. Simpson's reports, illustrated with careful drawings and measurements, challenged prevailing assumptions about the capabilities of Native American societies. The massive scale of Pueblo Bonito, with its estimated 600 rooms and four-story construction, forced a reconsideration of the complexity and organizational capacity of pre-Columbian civilizations in North America. The decades that followed brought a succession of explorers, photographers, and early archaeologists to the canyon, each adding pieces to the puzzle of understanding this remarkable civilization. The pioneering photographer William Henry Jackson captured the first images of the ruins in 1877. His glass plate negatives preserving for posterity the state of the structures. Before decades of archaeological excavation and the impacts of increased visitation, these early investigators often worked with limited understanding of proper archaeological technique, and their excavations, while revealing important information about Chacoan culture, also caused irreparable damage to the sites. The removal of artifacts to distant museums separated objects from their cultural context, making it more difficult for descendant communities to maintain their connections to ancestral knowledge. The establishment of Chaco Canyon as a national monument in 1907 represented growing recognition of the site's importance, but it also marked the beginning of a complex relationship between federal protection efforts and the interests of Pueblo communities who maintained cultural and spiritual connections to the canyon. The designation brought increased resources for preservation and research, but it also imposed a management framework that did not always accommodate traditional uses of the landscape. Systematic archaeological investigation began in earnest during the early 20th century, as researchers like Neil Judd conducted large-scale excavations that revealed the sophistication of Chacoan engineering and the complexity of their material culture. The discovery of preserved wooden beams that could be dated through tree analysis provided the first precise chronology for Chacoan construction, revealing the remarkable consistency of architectural planning across centuries of building activity. Perhaps most significantly, researchers began to understand that Chaco Canyon represented far more than a collection of impressive buildings. The recognition of the road system connecting the canyon to dozens of outlying communities revolutionized understanding of Chacoan society, revealing it as a regional system of unprecedented scale and complexity in the pre-Columbian Southwest. Aerial photography in the mid-20th century provided new perspectives on the extent and sophistication of this regional system. The linear features that had long puzzled ground-based observers revealed themselves as components of an engineered transportation network that demonstrated remarkable planning and coordination across vast distances. The development of new archaeological techniques, including ground-penetrating radar and satellite imagery, continued to reveal hidden aspects of Chacoan civilization. The discovery of astronomical alignments in the architecture provided insights into the sophisticated understanding of celestial cycles that guided Chacoan ceremonial and agricultural activities. Collaborative research projects involving Pueblo scholars and traditional knowledge holders began to bridge the gap between scientific archaeology and indigenous understanding of the site's significance. These partnerships revealed that oral traditions preserved in descendant communities contained accurate information about Chacoan practices and beliefs that complemented and enriched the archaeological record. The recognition of Chaco as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1987 acknowledged its global significance as one of humanity's great archaeological treasures. This designation brought international attention to the need for preservation, while also highlighting the ongoing challenges of protecting the sites from the impacts of energy development, increased visitation, and climate change. The dawn of the 21st century brought revolutionary new technologies to the study of Chaco Canyon, revealing secrets that had remained hidden beneath the desert surface for nearly a millennium. LiDAR scanning technology, which uses laser pulses to create detailed three-dimensional maps of the landscape, uncovered previously unknown structures and revealed the full extent of the Chacoan road system with unprecedented precision. These technological advances confirmed what Pueblo oral traditions had long maintained, that Chaco Canyon was the center of a vast network of communities that extended across much of the Southwest. The discovery of more than 400 miles of engineered roads connecting the canyon to outlying settlements demonstrated a level of regional integration that rivaled the great civilizations of Mesoamerica. Advanced dating techniques revealed that the construction of the great houses occurred in distinct phases that corresponded with favorable climatic conditions, while periods of drought and environmental stress led to adaptations in architectural style and settlement patterns. This evidence supported traditional ecological knowledge that emphasized the importance of adapting human activities to natural cycles rather than attempting to dominate the environment. Chemical analysis of pottery and other artifacts traced trade networks that brought exotic materials from as far away as central Mexico and the Pacific coast, revealing the extent of Chacoan influence and the sophistication of their economic systems. Turquoise from local mines was worked into jewelry and ceremonial objects that found their way to communities hundreds of miles away, while shells from distant oceans were transformed into ritual items that held deep symbolic meaning in Chacoan religious practices. Perhaps most remarkably, computer modeling of the astronomical alignments built into Chacoan architecture revealed a sophisticated understanding of celestial cycles that enabled precise prediction of eclipses, seasonal changes, and other significant astronomical events. The great houses functioned as massive observatories and calendars, encoding knowledge about time and cosmic order that guided agricultural activities and ceremonial cycles across the entire Chacoan system. Collaborative research projects involving archaeologists, astronomers, and Pueblo knowledge holders began to decode the complex messages embedded in Chacoan architecture. The placement of windows and doorways that frame celestial events, the orientation of kivas that align with significant stars, and the layout of great houses that mirror constellations, all revealed a worldview that saw human society as an integral part of cosmic order. These discoveries forced a fundamental reconsideration of the nature of Chacoan society. Rather than a hierarchical state system based on the accumulation of power and wealth, Chaco appeared to represent a unique form of social organization, based on the coordination of ceremonial activities and the management of knowledge about natural and supernatural forces. The role of the great kivas in this system became clearer as researchers recognized them as institutions for the integration of diverse communities through shared ritual practices. The massive scale of these structures, capable of accommodating hundreds of participants, reflected their function as centers for regional gatherings that reinforced social bonds and coordinated activities across vast distances. Climate reconstruction techniques revealed that the Chacoan fluorescence occurred during a period of relatively favorable environmental conditions, with reliable precipitation supporting expanded agricultural production and population growth. The subsequent dispersal from the canyon coincided with the onset of the medieval warm period's conclusion and the beginning of more variable and challenging climatic conditions. This evidence supported traditional knowledge about the importance of environmental adaptation and the wisdom of maintaining flexibility in the face of changing conditions. The Chacoan response to environmental stress dispersal and diversification rather than intensification and resistance represented a sophisticated understanding of sustainable resource management that remains relevant in the contemporary world. Modern Pueblo communities continue to maintain connections to Chaco Canyon through pilgrimage, ceremony, and the preservation of oral traditions that trace their ancestors' journeys from the canyon to their present homelands. These living connections provide crucial insights into the meaning and significance of Chacoan practices that cannot be recovered through archaeological investigation alone. The recognition of Pueblo intellectual property rights and traditional knowledge has led to new collaborative approaches to research and site management that honor both scientific inquiry and indigenous understanding of the landscape's significance. These partnerships have enriched understanding of Chacoan civilization, while ensuring that research proceeds in ways that respect the cultural sensitivities of descendant communities. Climate change and energy development pressures continue to threaten the integrity of Chacoan sites, highlighting the ongoing relevance of traditional ecological knowledge about sustainable relationships between human communities and their environments. The wisdom encoded in Chacoan practices offers valuable insights for contemporary challenges related to resource management, community resilience, and adaptation to environmental change. Today, the story of Chaco Canyon continues to unfold, not in the ruins themselves, but in the living communities of the Southwest that carry forward the knowledge and traditions of their ancestors. In the pueblos along the Rio Grande, in the ancient villages of the Hopi Mesas, and in communities scattered across the Four Corners region, the essential wisdom of Chaco persists in adapted forms that respond to contemporary challenges while maintaining connections to timeless principles. The agricultural techniques first perfected in the canyon's gardens continue to sustain Pueblo communities, adapted to new locations and changing environmental conditions, but retaining the fundamental understanding of working with natural cycles rather than against them. The careful management of water resources, the selection of drought-resistant crop varieties, and the integration of wild plants into agricultural systems all reflect knowledge systems that trace their origins to the innovative farmers of Canyon. Ceremonial practices that once filled the great kivas with hundreds of participants have evolved into more intimate gatherings, but they preserve the essential understanding of humanity's relationship with cosmic forces that guided Chacoan spiritual life. The astronomical knowledge that enabled precise prediction of celestial events continues to inform the timing of ceremonies and agricultural activities, maintaining connections between earthly cycles and heavenly movements that were first formalized. In the canyon's great houses, the architectural principles demonstrated in Chacoan construction continue to inspire contemporary building practices that emphasize harmony with landscape, careful orientation to natural features, and the use of local materials in ways that minimize environmental impact. Modern Pueblo builders still employ techniques for working with stone and adobe that were perfected by their ancestors in the canyon, adapted to contemporary needs, but retaining the aesthetic and practical wisdom accumulated over centuries. The road system that once connected Chaco to distant communities finds its modern expression in networks of kinship and ceremonial obligation that continue to link Pueblo communities across vast distances. Trading relationships have evolved into cultural exchanges that maintain the flow of knowledge and resources between communities, preserving the principle of regional cooperation that enabled Chacoan civilization to flourish. Educational initiatives, led by Pueblo scholars and traditional knowledge holders, are working to ensure that younger generations understand their connections to Chaco Canyon and the wisdom embedded in their ancestral traditions. These programs combine traditional teaching methods with modern educational approaches, creating new pathways for the transmission of cultural knowledge that honor both innovation and continuity. The ongoing research at Chaco Canyon continues to reveal new aspects of this remarkable civilization, but perhaps more importantly, it demonstrates the value of collaborative approaches that bring together scientific investigation and indigenous knowledge systems. These partnerships have enriched understanding while building bridges between different ways of knowing that were once considered incompatible. Art and literature, inspired by Chacoan themes, continue to explore the deeper meanings of this ancient civilization, creating new expressions of timeless wisdom that speak to contemporary audiences about the importance of living in harmony with natural and social environments. These creative works serve as bridges between past and present, making ancient knowledge accessible to new generations, while honoring its origins in specific cultural contexts. The challenges facing Chaco Canyon in the modern world, from energy development pressures to the impacts of climate change, mirror the environmental and social stresses that confronted the original inhabitants. The responses developed by contemporary Pueblo communities, emphasizing adaptation, cooperation, and sustainable resource management, reflect the same principles that enabled their ancestors to thrive in challenging circumstances. International recognition of Chaco Canyon as a World Heritage Site has brought global attention to the need for preservation, but it has also highlighted the relevance of Chacoan wisdom for addressing contemporary challenges. The principles of regional cooperation, sustainable resource management, and adaptive flexibility that characterized Chacoan civilization offer valuable insights for modern efforts to address climate change, resource scarcity, and social inequality. The story of Chaco Canyon ultimately transcends its specific historical and geographical context to speak to fundamental questions about the relationship between human communities and their environments. The wisdom developed by the ancient inhabitants of the canyon, their understanding of cosmic cycles, their mastery of sustainable agriculture, their creation of inclusive social institutions, relevant and inspiring for contemporary efforts to build more resilient and equitable societies. In the end, the greatest legacy of Chaco Canyon may not be the impressive ruins that draw thousands of visitors each year, but the living traditions that continue to guide Pueblo communities in their efforts to maintain cultural identity while adapting to changing circumstances. These traditions demonstrate that the wisdom of the past need not be preserved as museum pieces, but can serve as sources of guidance and inspiration for creating better futures. The children who grow up in Pueblo communities today still learn to observe the movements of the sun and stars, to understand the subtle signs that announce changing seasons, and to recognize their responsibilities as stewards of the land and keepers of ancient knowledge. In their continued practice of these traditions, the spirit of Chaco Canyon lives on, adapted to new circumstances but maintaining its essential commitment to harmony, balance, and the integration of human communities with the larger cosmos. As night falls over the modern Southwest, the same constellations that guided Chacoan astronomers continue their eternal dance across the desert sky. The great houses stand silent now, their massive walls slowly returning to the earth from which they were raised. But the knowledge they embodied flows onward like an underground stream, surfacing in unexpected places to nourish new growth and sustain the ongoing journey of human understanding. In this way, the ancient people of Chaco Canyon achieved a kind of immortality not in the preservation of their physical structures, but in the enduring wisdom they embedded in the landscape, and passed down through generations of descendants who continue to draw strength and guidance from their remarkable legacy. The canyon itself remains a teacher, offering lessons about the possibilities and responsibilities of human civilization to all who approach it with respect and openness to its enduring messages. The wind that once carried the voices of thousands now whispers through empty doorways and broken walls, but it carries with it the memory of a people who understood that true greatness lies not in the accumulation of power or wealth, but in the creation of systems that honor the connections between all forms of life and the cosmic forces that guide their unfolding. In learning to listen to that wind, we begin to understand what the ancient people of Chaco Canyon knew: that wisdom is not a possession to be hoarded, but a gift to be shared across time and space, connecting us all in the great web of existence that encompasses both the material and spiritual dimensions of reality. The story ends where it began, in silence and stone, in the eternal dance of light and shadow across the high desert landscape. But this silence is not empty. It is pregnant with memory and meaning, holding space for all who seek to understand the deeper patterns that connect human experience with the larger rhythms of earth and sky. In that silence, the ancient people of Chaco Canyon continue to speak, their voices carried on the desert wind, their wisdom encoded in the stones they shaped with such care and precision. And so the great circle closes and opens again, as all true stories must. The canyon rests in its eternal embrace of sky and stone, ready to teach new generations of seekers the timeless lessons of adaptation, cooperation, and reverence for the sacred patterns that govern all existence. The ancient people have returned to the stars from which they came, but their light continues to shine in the living traditions of their descendants and in the enduring mystery of the remarkable civilization they created in this place among the rocks. Here, in the silence between heartbeats, between the rise and fall of civilizations, between the movement of planets and the turning of seasons, the truth remains that all things are connected, that wisdom flows like water from generation to generation, and that the greatest monuments we can leave are not built of stone, but woven into the fabric of human understanding. The ancient people of Chaco Canyon understood this truth, lived it, and passed it on. In honoring their memory, we honor the possibility of our own awakening to the deep patterns that connect all life in the great web of existence that encompasses us all. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the remarkable story of Chaco Canyon's ancient people. If these timeless tales of wisdom, mystery, and human resilience have moved you, please like this video. Share it with others who might find inspiration in these ancient voices, and subscribe to Fall Asleep to History for more journeys into the depths of human experience. In sharing these stories, we honor the memory of those who came before and plant seeds of understanding for those who will come after. Sweet dreams, and may the wisdom of the ancients guide your rest.